Imagine the Vatican at night in the late 15th century. Candles flicker against marble walls, silk robes rustle in the shadows, and the holiest palace of Christendom hides secrets more fitting for a royal court of vice than for the seat of St. Peter. The man at the centre of it all is Rodrigo Borgia, soon to become Pope Alexander VI, a figure whose rise from the dusty roads of Spain to the throne of the Vatican is as scandalous as it is spectacular. To understand how the notorious Banquet of the Chestnuts could ever take place inside the Vatican, we must first trace the path of the man who made it possible. A nephew of fortune. Rodrigo Borgia was born in 1431 inches, Xàtiva, a small town in the Kingdom of Valencia. At the time, Spain was still a patchwork of kingdoms, locked in struggles against both one another and the remnants of Moorish rule. His family was not poor, but neither was it particularly noble. Rodrigo's fortune lay in a single connection: his maternal uncle, Alfonso de Borja. Alfonso's rise was meteoric. He went from an obscure churchman in Aragon to Pope Calixtus III in 1455. And with his elevation, Alfonso opened doors for his nephews that would have been unimaginable otherwise. Rodrigo, clever, ambitious, and strikingly handsome, was brought to Rome under his uncle's wing. At just 25 years old, he was made a cardinal. Shortly afterward, he was appointed Vice-Chancellor of the Holy See, a position he would hold for more than 3 decades. It was one of the most powerful administrative posts in the papacy, controlling finances, appointments, and correspondence. Rodrigo had found his stage, and Rome would never forget him. A city of saints and sinners. To grasp Rodrigo's world, we must picture Rome in the late 1400 seconds. It was a city of contradictions. By day, pilgrims trudged through its ancient ruins, visiting holy shrines and marvelling at relics. By night, its narrow streets filled with thieves, mercenaries, and prostitutes. The papacy itself was both the guardian of Christian salvation and the greatest landowner in Italy. It was, above all, a political prize. Within this volatile mix, Rodrigo thrived. He was not a man of austere holiness, far from it. He surrounded himself with mistresses, courtiers, and poets. His most enduring partner was Vanozza dei Catanei, with whom he had 4 children: Cesare, Juan, Geoffrey, and the infamous Lucrezia. That a cardinal lived openly with a mistress and acknowledged children was shocking even by Renaissance standards, but Rodrigo's charisma, generosity, and sheer energy made him untouchable. The cardinal condemned. His behaviour, however, did not go unnoticed. Pope Pius II, a humanist scholar before his election, wrote with disgust about Rodrigo's excesses. In one infamous letter, Pius warned him that his public debauchery risked eternal damnation. Yet Rodrigo was undeterred. For him, religion was not about piety, it was about power. He was building a dynasty, and the papacy would be the crown. The conclave of 1492, the death of Pope Innocent VIII in 1492, set the stage for one of the most scandalous papal elections in history. The conclave was less a gathering of holy men than a marketplace of bribery. Rodrigo Borgia, with the immense wealth he had accumulated through his office, outbid every rival. Gold, promises of bishoprics, castles, and even palaces flowed into the hands of cardinals. One chronicler later wrote bitterly that everything was for sale. When the smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel announcing his election, Rodrigo had achieved what no Spaniard had ever done before. He was Pope Alexander VI. The triumphant coronation. His coronation was a spectacle befitting an emperor rather than a shepherd of souls. The streets of Rome were draped in silks, fountains flowed with wine, and processions of courtiers paraded under gilded banners. Alexander himself, wearing a triple tiara heavy with jewels, rode through the city on a white horse, basking in the adoration of the crowds. Rome had seen corrupt popes before, but Alexander brought a new energy, a theatrical flair that turned corruption into pageantry. Early reforms, a brief mirage. At first, there was a glimmer of hope. Alexander knew that appearances mattered. He re-established public order in a city rife with banditry, personally presiding over cases of justice. For a brief moment, Rome saw in him a capable ruler. Merchants and artisans prospered as security returned to the streets. Pilgrims spoke of a pope who combined majesty with decisiveness. But beneath the surface, the real engine of his reign was already whirring, the advancement of his children. For Alexander, the papacy was not a spiritual office, it was a throne, and he would turn it into the foundation of a dynasty to rival the kings of Europe. His reformist facade quickly gave way to nepotism on a scale Rome had never seen. The shadow of ambition. Observers began to whisper, what was the Pope building? Why were his teenage children suddenly showered with titles and lands? Why did Cesare, barely 20, wear the robes of a cardinal while Lucrezia was married off to powerful allies? The answer was clear to anyone watching closely. Alexander VI intended to carve out a Borgia dominion secured by blood, marriage, and the sword. And to fuel this ambition, he would need gold, vast amounts of it, gold that would come from indulgences, from simony, and from the relentless selling of church offices. Gold that would one day pay for feasts so scandalous they would echo down the centuries, foreshadowing the scandal to come. It is here, in the first years of Alexander's reign, that the seeds of the infamous Banquet of the Chestnuts were sown. For while the Pope presented himself as a bringer of order, in the shadows he fostered a court of extravagance, lust and ambition. Courtesans whispered of wild nights in the papal apartments. Diplomats wrote home of banquets where holy men and prostitutes dined at the same table. The Vatican, once the citadel of Christendom, was slowly transforming into a stage where the boundaries between the sacred and the profane would collapse in a single night of revelry, the night of Halloween, 1501. But before we arrive at that scandalous banquet, we must follow Alexander and his children as they tighten their grip on power, turning the Vatican into the beating heart of Renaissance corruption. When Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI in 1492, the world thought it had seen everything the papacy had to offer. Nepotism, greed, and scandal were nothing new in Rome. But Alexander would elevate corruption to an art form, constructing not only a papal court of excess but a family empire designed to dominate Italy itself. To understand how the Vatican descended into scenes like the Banquet of the Chestnuts, we must look at the machinery Alexander built, the intertwining of power, family, and money that turned the church into his personal kingdom. Nepotism as dynasty building. Alexander VI wasted no time in elevating his children. Juan, his second-born but favoured son, was given titles and lands, becoming Duke of Gandia and later Captain General of the Papal States. Cesare, originally destined for the church, was appointed cardinal at the age of just 18. His youngest son, Geoffrey, was married into Neapolitan nobility, while his daughter Lucrezia became the Pope's most powerful bargaining chip in a series of marriage alliances. To outsiders, this brazen nepotism was shocking, yet within the logic of Renaissance Italy it was not unusual dukes and kings alike elevated their kin. What made Alexander unique was that he sat not on a secular throne, but on the throne of St. Peter. Every appointment he made blurred the line between spiritual leadership and dynastic ambition. The Vatican, apartments, transformed. Soon, the Vatican itself began to reflect Alexander's new vision. The papal apartments were renovated into sumptuous chambers decorated by Pinturicchio, filled with gold, marble, and frescoes depicting not saints but mythological scenes. The palace, once austere, became a theatre of magnificence, but behind the gilded walls a darker transformation was underway. Feasts, entertainments, and private gatherings filled the calendar. The Pope's mistress, Giulia Farnese, renowned across Italy as Giulia la Bella, was given rooms near the papal chambers. Diplomats and visitors whispered that the Vatican now resembled more a princely court of lust and indulgence than a holy palace. Johann Burchard, the invisible witness. Among the many who observed this transformation, one figure stands out: Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies. A German by birth, Burchard was meticulous, dry, and devoted to order. His role was to ensure that papal rituals were carried out with precision, every procession, every mass, every official feast. Yet Burchard had another habit. He recorded everything. In his diary, the Liber Notarum, he noted not only the sacred but the profane. Banquets, scandals, even whispered rumours, all were preserved in his neat Latin hand. Though often silent in person, Burchard became history's most invaluable witness to the Borgias Rome. Without him, the world might never have known of the night when chestnuts rolled across Vatican floors. A murder in the Tiber. But before the scandalous feasts, tragedy struck the Borgias. In 1497, Juan, Alexander's beloved son, disappeared after a night of revelry. Days later, his body was dragged from the Tiber, riddled with stab wounds. The city buzzed with rumours. Had jealous nobles struck him down? Or worse, had his own brother Cesare ordered the killing? Alexander was devastated. In grief, he even spoke of reform, vowing to cleanse the church of corruption and rededicate himself to spiritual matters. For a brief time, the Pope's household change banquets were scaled back, mistresses dismissed and prayers increased. Rome whispered that perhaps God had struck the Borgias with divine punishment. But the reform was short-lived. Grief soon hardened into resolve. If Juan's death had weakened the family, Alexander would ensure that Cesare rose to take his place. And Cesare, freed from the robes of a cardinal, would become one of the most feared warlords of Renaissance Italy. Cesare Borgia, from cardinal to conqueror. In 1498, Cesare shed his red hat and donned armour. With the backing of the French king, he carved out a bloody path through central Italy. Towns that resisted were crushed. Enemies found themselves strangled or stabbed. To Cesare, terror was not cruelty but strategy. Niccolo Machiavelli, who observed him closely, would later model his vision of the prince on Cesare Borgia, a ruler who combined audacity, cunning, and ruthlessness. The papacy, meant to be the guardian of souls, had become the engine of a military machine. The cost of ambition. But war required money, vast sums of it. Alexander turned to the only source he truly controlled, the church itself. Indulgences were sold not as spiritual relief but as a direct revenue stream. Wealthy families bought bishoprics and cardinals' hats. Posts within the curia were auctioned off to the highest bidder. Even the College of Cardinals, the sacred body that elected popes, was expanded by Alexander beyond precedent. More cardinals meant more offices to sell, more income for the papal treasury, and more loyal allies bound to the Borgias. Rome became a city where every favour had a price. Pilgrims still came to pray, but they walked streets filled with merchants hawking indulgence letters, officials collecting fees, and noblemen hosting feasts sponsored by papal gold. A court of extravagance. In this climate, the papal court grew infamous. Cardinals competed in displays of wealth, throwing banquets where fountains gushed with wine, acrobats entertained guests, and courtesans mingled freely with clerics. To be part of Alexander's circle was to partake in a world where the sacred and profane mixed freely. Johann Burchard recorded it all, sometimes with dry amusement, sometimes with silent horror. He noted how the Pope laughed at ribald jokes, how Cesare and Lucrezia presided over feasts like royalty, how the line between family, court, and church dissolved. Rome under the Borgias. For ordinary Romans, life under the Borgias was a paradox. On one hand, Alexander's determination to impose order brought stability to a city long plagued by lawlessness. Banditry was reduced, trade flourished, and artists found patronage. On the other, corruption was everywhere, and the church's reputation sank to new lows. Diplomats from across Europe wrote home in astonishment. Reports of orgies, bribes, and assassinations flowed into royal courts. Some saw it as grotesque entertainment, others as evidence that the papacy was beyond salvation. Reformers in the north, men like Savonarola in Florence, pointed to Alexander as proof that Rome was Babylon reborn. Toward the Banquet of the Chestnuts. By the year 1500, the Borgias stood at the height of their power. Cesare controlled territories in central Italy. Lucrezia was married into one of the most powerful noble families. Alexander commanded wealth that rivaled kings. The Jubilee year drew thousands of pilgrims to Rome, filling papal coffers even further. Yet with triumph came arrogance. The Vatican was no longer simply a palace of faith, it was a stage for spectacle. Banquets grew ever more elaborate. the entertainments more daring, the rumours more scandalous. It was within this intoxicating mixture of power and indulgence that the infamous night of Halloween, 1501, would unfold. The machinery of corruption was now complete, family elevated, enemies subdued, wealth secured. All that remained was the unbridled display of excess that would shock Christendom for centuries to come. By the turn of the 16th century, the Borgias stood at the summit of power. Pope Alexander VI had transformed the Vatican into the beating heart of a family empire, while Cesare Borgia, his most ruthless son, had become a warlord whose shadow fell across Italy. Yet even as Cesare conquered with the sword, his sister Lucrezia was forced into a role equally ruthless, the pawn of marriage alliances that bound the Borgia dynasty to the noblest houses of Europe. Together, their stories reveal how family ambition and personal scandal set the stage for one of the most infamous nights in papal history. Cesare, the Prince of Terror. Cesare Borgia was unlike any other figure of his age. Tall, dark, and strikingly charismatic, he radiated a magnetism that drew both admiration and fear. After abandoning the cardinal's hat in 1498, he embraced the life of a soldier with ferocious energy. With French backing, Cesare launched campaigns across Romagna, crushing resistance town by town. His methods were brutal but effective. Towns that surrendered were spared, those that resisted were left with corpses swinging from city gates. To Cesare, cruelty was not personal, it was tactical. He understood what Machiavelli would later immortalize, that it is safer for a ruler to be feared than loved. Machiavelli, serving as Florence's envoy to Cesare, watched him with awe. "I do not know what fate holds for him," Machiavelli wrote, "but I know that his designs are great and his means sufficient." To the Florentine diplomat, Cesare embodied the qualities of a perfect prince. Bold, cunning, and ruthless in pursuit of power. Lucrezia, the bride of Rome. While Cesare ruled with the sword, Lucrezia Borgia was caught in chains of silk. Intelligent, beautiful, and golden-haired, she became the linchpin of her father's marital diplomacy. At only 13, she was married to Giovanni Sforza, linking the Borgias to the powerful lords of Milan. But when the alliance soured, Alexander demanded an annulment, declaring humiliatingly that the marriage had never been consummated. Whispers soon spread. Was Giovanni impotent, or had the Pope sought to cover up something darker, an incestuous bond between Lucrezia and her father or brother? The rumours would never fully die, though historians debate their truth. What is certain is that Lucrezia was used again and again as a bargaining chip. Her second marriage, to Alfonso of Aragon, tied the Borgias to Naples. But when politics shifted, Cesare had Alfonso murdered in cold blood. Lucrezia, left a widow, was married yet again, this time to Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara. Here, at last, she would find some measure of independence. But in Rome, her name was already entwined with scandal. The Vatican stage. As Cesare carved his dominion with steel and Lucrezia was shuffled between beds and thrones, the Vatican itself became a theatre of decadence. The papal apartments glittered with frescoes of nymphs and gods, painted by Pinturicchio. Musicians played lutes and viols late into the night. Poets composed verses celebrating not saints, but the beauty of Giulia Farnese and the charms of Lucrezia. Banquets grew ever more extravagant. Guests feasted on peacocks glazed with gold, capons stuffed with truffles, and fountains that gushed with sweet wine. Courtesans mingled freely with cardinals, their laughter echoing in candlelit halls. What had once been the austere palace of the popes now resembled a stage where every appetite was indulged. Loyalty was secured not only by gold but by shared excess. Those who partook in the revels became complicit, bound to the Borgias not by faith but by vice. To refuse was to risk exclusion, and in Rome, exclusion could be fatal. The Jubilee of 1500, triumph and arrogance. In 1500, the Church declared a Jubilee year, promising indulgences to all who made pilgrimage to Rome. Thousands poured into the city, swelling the papal coffers. Alexander used the occasion to display his grandeur. Processions dazzled with silks and jewels, while Cesare, resplendent in armour, was celebrated as the defender of the faith even as he plotted new campaigns of conquest. For the Borgias, the Jubilee was proof of invincibility. Rome itself seemed to bow before them, but triumph bred arrogance. Secure in power and wealth, Alexander and his children grew reckless, their feasts more daring, their scandals more public. The stage was set for a night that would shock Christendom. Whispers of incest and darkness. Among the many rumours that clung to the Borgias, none was more poisonous than the whispers of incest. Enemies of the family claimed that Alexander shared his bed with his daughter, or that Lucrezia bore children fathered by her brother. Whether slander or truth, the rumours stuck. Some chroniclers describe Cesare's jealousy, his fury at Lucrezia's lovers, and his role in orchestrating Alfonso of Aragon's murder. Others pointed to Alexander's open doting on his daughter, his indulgence of her whims, and the privileges she enjoyed at court. For the people of Rome, truth mattered less than perception. The papacy had become a scandal, and Lucrezia, its unwilling symbol, prelude to the Banquet. By 1501, Rome was simmering with gossip. Diplomats reported home of nightly feasts, of masked dances, of courtesans invited to dine with the Pope himself. But none of these rumours would compare to the event that loomed on the horizon. On Halloween night, in the Vatican apartments of Cesare Borgia, a banquet was prepared unlike any other. The guest list glittered with nobles, cardinals, and dignitaries. Musicians tuned their instruments, candles were lit, and 50 courtesans were summoned to provide entertainment. The stage was set. The Vatican, the holiest palace in Christendom, would soon witness an orgy that defied imagination, an orgy that history would remember as the Banquet of the Chestnuts. On the night of the 30th of October, 1501 Halloween, the Vatican witnessed a spectacle so outrageous that even in an age accustomed to decadence, it would be remembered for centuries. Known forever as the Banquet of the Chestnuts, the event unfolded not in the taverns of Rome nor in the palaces of princes, but within the very walls of the Apostolic Palace itself, the heart of Christendom. The guest list of sin. The host was Cesare Borgia, ruthless warlord and son of the Pope. The setting, his private apartments in the Vatican, frescoed with mythological scenes by Pinturicchio. The guests, high-ranking cardinals, Roman nobles, foreign ambassadors, and 50 courtesans summoned for entertainment. Pope Alexander VI himself was present, along with his daughter, Lucrezia. Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, stood silently in the shadows. His role was to oversee the rituals of papal life, but on this night, he became the chronicler of scandal. With careful, almost clinical precision, he recorded what he saw. Without his Liber Notarum, the world might never have known the truth. A banquet of excess. The evening began as any courtly feast might. Long tables groaning with delicacies, goblets overflowing with wine, laughter echoing off painted walls. Guests dined on roasted game, honeyed pastries, and exotic fruits brought from distant lands. Musicians played lutes and shawms, poets recited verses in honour of the Pope and his family. But as the night deepened, the mask of respectability slipped away. Courtesans dressed in silks and jewels began to dance. At first the movements were graceful, elegant, almost artistic. Then, slowly, the dances grew bolder, their steps more suggestive, their garments falling away piece by piece. The chestnuts scattered. At a signal, servants entered carrying baskets filled not with bread or fruit but with chestnuts. They poured them across the floor, scattering them between the candles. Then, in a display that shocked even seasoned diplomats, the 50 courtesans now nude were ordered to crawl on hands and knees, gathering the chestnuts while the guests watched and laughed. By candlelight, the scene was both grotesque and mesmerizing. The marble floors of the Vatican, the flicker of holy frescoes overhead, and women scrambling naked through the shadows while cardinals and nobles cheered. The orgy begins. The banquet now dissolved into an orgy. Burchard, dry and restrained as ever, recorded that, after the banquet, the candelabra, with lighted candles, were placed on the floor, and chestnuts were strewn about, which the naked courtesans picked up, crawling on hands and knees. Then followed the contest, with prizes offered silken tunics, shoes, hats, and other garments for those men who could perform the act of coitus most often with these courtesans. In other words, a competition of lust. Guests, stripped of their robes of office, threw themselves into the contest. Courtesans moved from man to man, while servants counted couplings and tallied results. Cesare and Lucrezia presided like monarchs, offering prizes. Pope Alexander himself, though nearly 70, was present watching, perhaps even partaking. A night of blasphemy. It is difficult to overstate the blasphemy of this moment. The Vatican, seat of the Vicar of Christ, had been transformed into a brothel. Candles meant to illuminate the Mass now lit the writhing bodies of clerics and prostitutes. The chestnut, humble symbol of autumn, became the token of a night of sin. To reformers, this was Babylon reborn, living proof that Rome was corrupted beyond salvation. To the participants, it was perhaps nothing more than indulgence, a night of laughter, pleasure, and power. But to history, it became the most infamous orgy ever hosted under papal roofs. Burchard's account. Johann Burchard's record remains maddeningly brief. He wrote in Latin, with the detachment of a bureaucrat, no embellishment, no judgment, just facts. Some historians have wondered whether the event was exaggerated, whether Protestant propagandists later magnified it into myth. But Burchard was no sensationalist. He was a man whose job depended on precision. His dry words, uncoloured by emotion, make the event all the more shocking. If even half of what he recorded is true, the Banquet of the Chestnuts was a scandal unparalleled in papal history. The rumours spread. Word of the banquet did not remain confined to the Vatican. Ambassadors carried whispers back to their courts. In Florence, Venice and Paris, tales circulated of a pope who presided over orgies. In Northern Europe, reformers seized on the story as proof of Rome's corruption. For Martin Luther and his followers a generation later, the banquet became a symbol of why the church had to be cleansed. In Rome itself, people whispered cautiously. To speak too openly against the Borgias was dangerous. Yet even the citizens of the Eternal City, hardened to scandal, could not help but feel that something sacred had been profaned forever. Power through vice. Why did the Borgias host such a night? Some historians argue it was simply indulgence, the excess of a family drunk on power. Others see it as calculated, a demonstration of control, a ritual binding guests to complicity. To partake in the Pope's orgy was to share in his corruption, and therefore to become loyal, unable to denounce what one had also enjoyed. The Vatican, for that single night, became not merely a palace of sin but a theatre of power. The aftermath. When dawn broke over Rome, the Vatican's marble floors bore the stains of wine and wax. Courtesans slipped away into the streets. Guests returned to their palaces, carrying with them memories they would never confess openly. And Pope Alexander VI resumed his duties as if nothing had happened, conducting mass, issuing bulls, and ruling Christendom. But history does not forget. The Banquet of the Chestnuts became the defining scandal of the Borgia papacy, whispered in every court, recorded in every chronicle, remembered as the night when the Vatican itself surrendered to vice. Toward the fall. The banquet did not end Alexander's reign. Indeed, the Pope continued for 2 more years, pressing forward with his schemes for Cesare and Lucrezia. But the seed of infamy had been sown. When he died suddenly in 1503, many believed it was divine judgment. His enemies rejoiced, his allies fell silent. Yet the banquet lived on in memory not as a passing night of sin, but as a symbol of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely, even at the very heart of the Church. By 1502, Cesare Borgia's star had reached its zenith. With his father's backing and his ruthless ambition, he carved out a dominion across central Italy. Cities trembled at his name. Condottieri who dared to oppose him, men like Vitellozzo, Vitelli and Oliverotto da Fermo, were invited to banquets, then strangled under Cesare's watch. He was brilliant, cold and utterly without mercy. Machiavelli, who met him in person, admired him deeply. In The Prince, he held up Cesare as the model ruler, cunning, fearless and willing to use cruelty as a weapon. For a moment, it seemed as if the Borgias might carve out a lasting dynasty in Italy, rivaling the Medici of Florence or the Sforza of Milan. But fortune is fickle. The very power of the Borgias made them enemies everywhere, France, Spain, Venice, Florence all saw Cesare as a threat, and without the Pope's protection, even the Duke of Valentinois was vulnerable. Poison and death. In August 1503, Alexander VI was still plotting new campaigns for Cesare. Then, suddenly, he fell gravely ill. Accounts differ. Some say he and Cesare both drank poisoned wine, meant for a guest, but only the Pope succumbed. Others claim it was simple malaria, carried by the summer air of Rome. Whatever the truth, Alexander VI died on the 18th of August 1503. His death was grotesque, like a parody of divine justice. His body, bloated and blackened, swelled so horribly that it could barely be forced into a coffin. Rome, which had endured his reign in fear, erupted in celebration. Bells rang, crowds jeered, and pamphlets declared his passing the end of an age of corruption. Cesare, too, was struck down by the same illness. He survived, but weakened, unable to seize control of the conclave that followed. The fall of Cesare. Without Alexander, Cesare's empire collapsed like a house of cards. Enemies rose against him. Lands once conquered in his name slipped away. The new pope, Julius II, feared and hated him. Stripped of titles, abandoned by allies, Cesare was forced into exile. He fled to Spain, where he sought refuge under the crown. But even there his restless ambition could not be contained. In 1507, while fighting for the King of Navarre, Cesare Borgia rode into battle one last time. Surrounded by enemies, he fought with reckless courage, cutting down foe after foe. But at last, he was overwhelmed. His body lay naked on the field, pierced with wounds, abandoned by the soldiers who once feared his name. He was only 31 years old. Lucrezia's transformation. While her father and brother's careers ended in blood and disgrace, Lucrezia Borgia forged a different path. Married into the Este family of Ferrara, she became duchess, a role she embraced with surprising grace. In Ferrara, Lucrezia shed the reputation of poisoner and temptress. She patronized poets, musicians, and artists. She raised children, governed with wisdom, and earned the respect of her people. Visitors who expected to find a scheming femme fatale instead discovered a serene, cultured woman devoted to her court. And yet, the whispers never died. For centuries, Lucrezia would be remembered not as a duchess, but as the seductress of legend, the woman who, according to rumour, shared lovers with her father and brother, who carried poison in her rings, who presided over orgies. Perhaps the truth was more ordinary. Perhaps the legend was too delicious to abandon. The infamy of the Banquet. The Banquet of the Chestnuts lingered in memory, casting a shadow over every account of the Borgias. Reformers seized upon it as proof that Rome was beyond redemption. For Martin Luther and his followers, the scandal was almost divine ammunition evidence that the papacy itself was rotten to the core. Even centuries later, historians debated the event. Was Burchard's account exaggerated? Did Protestant polemicists inflate the details to blacken the Borgias further? Some suggested the story was too grotesque to be entirely true, yet the dry, bureaucratic tone of Burchard's diary makes dismissal difficult. The truth perhaps lies somewhere between, but history is not only about truth, it is about what people choose to remember. And what the world remembered of the Borgias was decadence, lust, and the banquet that turned the Vatican into a brothel. The Borgia legacy. When we speak of the Renaissance, we often think of art, science, and discovery. Leonardo painting the Mona Lisa, Michelangelo carving the David, Columbus crossing the ocean. Yet the Renaissance was also an age of ruthless politics, of princes who poisoned rivals and popes who waged war. The Borgias embodied this paradox. They were patrons of art and letters, but also masters of corruption. They left behind no great dynasty, no lasting kingdom. What they left was something stranger, a legend of sin so enduring that 500 years later, their name still conjures whispers of poison, lust, and scandal. The lesson of the Borgias. In the end, the story of the Borgias is not only about corruption, it is about the fragility of power. Alexander VI ruled Christendom, but died despised. Cesare seemed invincible, but perished naked on a battlefield. Lucrezia tried to escape her family's shadow, but history bound her to their sins. And the Banquet of the Chestnuts, whether every detail is true or not, remains as a warning. That when power becomes unchecked, when pleasure becomes the measure of rule, even the holiest of places can fall into ruin. Epilogue. Today, visitors to the Vatican marvel at the Sistine Chapel, at Raphael's frescoes, at the grandeur of St. Peter's. Few remember that, in those same halls, chestnuts once rolled across the floor while courtesans crawled naked for the amusement of a pope and his children. But history remembers, and history never forgives.